the moment, everything changes. Right now, somewhere in your life, someone is living rent-free inside your head. Maybe it's the manager who publicly dismissed your idea in a meeting while everyone watched in silence. Maybe it's the ex who told you that you were too sensitive, and somehow, years later, those two words still surface when you least expect them. Maybe it's a stranger on the internet who typed 14 words about your post and somehow managed to unravel your entire afternoon. Or maybe it's the parent whose voice you still hear in quiet moments, narrating your limitations back to you in the language they taught you before you were old enough to question whether it was true. And here's the brutal truth that nobody wants to say out loud. You're letting it happen. Not because you're weak. Not because you're broken. Not because there's something fundamentally wrong with how you're wired. But because your brain is doing exactly what it was built to do over 300,000 years of human evolution. And it has absolutely no idea that a sarcastic comment from a coworker is not the same as a predator at the edge of the forest. That's the gap. That's the fault line between who you are now and who you're capable of becoming. And that's exactly what this book is going to help you close. Think for a moment about the people in your life who seem genuinely unshakable. Not the ones who suppress everything and call it strength. Not the ones who've simply numbed themselves to the point where nothing lands anymore. The ones who absorb the full weight of a difficult interaction, process it with clarity, and emerge from it centered. The ones who can sit across from harsh criticism without flinching, who can absorb rejection without catastrophizing, who can handle conflict without losing themselves in it. What do those people have that most people don't? It isn't luck. It isn't a particularly easy life. It isn't some genetic predisposition for calm or an absence of pain in their history. Almost without exception, the most emotionally resilient people you will ever meet have histories that contain as much difficulty, rejection, and wounding as anyone else's. What's different is not what happened to them. It's what they built in response to it. They learned a specific set of skills. Skills that rewired the way their nervous system responds to threat, judgment, and rejection. Skills that change the relationship between an external event and an internal reaction. Skills that, when practiced consistently, literally alter the physical architecture of the brain, making emotional regulation not an act of willpower, but a default setting. And those skills are completely teachable. That's the premise of this book. That's the promise. Over the next 15 chapters, you're going to discover a complete framework for becoming psychologically bulletproof. Not the fake kind where you pretend nothing bothers you. Not the cold kind where you shut down your emotional life to protect yourself from being hurt. But the real kind. The kind that lets you feel everything while being controlled by nothing. The kind that transforms your relationship with criticism, rejection, conflict, and difficult people so completely that they stop being threats and start being tools. You'll understand why certain people have an almost supernatural ability to destabilize you, and why that ability is based entirely on something happening in your own nervous system, not something inherent to them. You'll learn how to take that power back, permanently. You'll rewire your brain's threat detection system so that criticism becomes data instead of devastation. You'll build internal structures so solid that other people's moods, judgments, and attacks simply cannot find a way in. You'll also discover something that surprises almost every person who goes through this process. The very people who trigger you most are not your enemies. They are, in a very real and functional sense, your most valuable teachers. The friction they create in your life is precisely the resistance that builds your strongest psychological muscle. But that reframe only becomes available once you understand what's actually happening in your brain when someone gets under your skin And that's where we begin. Why your brain turns criticism into catastrophe. There's a small almond-shaped cluster of neurons sitting deep inside your brain called the amygdala. It's been doing the same job for millions of years, scanning the environment for danger and triggering a survival response the instant it detects a threat. In the Pleistocene era, this system saved your ancestors' lives. The rustle in the tall grass, the shadow at the edge of the firelight, the shift in a rival's expression right before aggression turned physical. The amygdala caught these signals in milliseconds and flooded the body with adrenaline and cortisol before the conscious mind had time to process a single thought. The body was moving, fleeing, fighting, freezing, before awareness even caught up. And the problem is this: that same ancient system is still running today, and it cannot tell the difference between a saber-toothed predator and your supervisor saying, "I don't think this approach is going to work," in front of a room full of people. Both events activate identical neural circuitry. Both produce the same cascade of stress hormones. Both temporarily hijack the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for rational judgment, nuanced thinking, and emotional regulation, leaving you fighting, fleeing, or freezing at exactly the moment you most need clarity, composure, and strategic thinking. This is not a character flaw. This is not weakness. This is neurological architecture that hasn't updated since humans were living in small bands on the African savanna. Understanding this matters enormously because most of the shame people carry about their emotional reactivity is based on a false premise: the idea that they should be able to simply choose not to react. The neuroscience tells a far more complicated and forgiving story. Here's what makes it genuinely dangerous in the modern world: the threats don't stop. In prehistoric life, the predator either caught you or it didn't. The danger passed. The cortisol metabolized. Your nervous system reset to baseline and you carried on. The stress response was designed for acute, short-duration threats. Spikes of alarm followed by resolution, followed by recovery. Today, the triggers are relentless and they never fully resolve. Every notification on your phone is a potential ambush. Every performance review is a tribal judgment. Every public critique in a meeting, on social media, in a relationship, activates the same primal alarm system designed for physical emergencies, and then keeps it activated for hours or days through rumination, anticipation, and replay. Neuroscientists call what happens next sensitization. Every time your amygdala fires in response to a specific type of trigger, being criticized in public, being ignored by someone whose approval you want, being contradicted in a conversation, the neural pathway connecting that trigger to that response grows stronger, faster, and more automatic. The brain, operating on its fundamental principle of efficiency, optimizes for patterns that repeat. If you've reacted with anxiety to criticism 1,000 times, the anxiety response becomes nearly instantaneous. The pathway has been worn deep. You are literally training your brain to be more reactive, not less, every time you react without deliberate intervention. And the downstream damage doesn't stay contained to the moment of the trigger. When you're emotionally hijacked, you don't just lose your composure, you lose access to the best version of your thinking. Research on what's called cognitive narrowing shows that stress hormones literally reduce the range of information your brain can process simultaneously. You become tunnel-visioned. Creative solutions disappear from view. Nuance vanishes. You see threat, and you see it everywhere. You say things you immediately regret. You make decisions from a place of fear or wounded pride that you would never make from a clear head. You replay the conversation for hours, running alternative scripts in your mind, rehearsing comebacks to someone who has long since moved on with their day. Meanwhile, the person who triggered you isn't thinking about you at all. This is the invisible tax of emotional reactivity. It isn't just the moment of the trigger that costs you. It's the compounding interest, the hours spent ruminating, the relationships strained by spillover reactions, the opportunities missed because you were too consumed by yesterday's wound to be present for today's possibility. The solution is not avoidance. Difficult people are not a glitch in the system. They are a permanent feature of any meaningful life. If you want to build something, lead something, love someone deeply, or contribute anything that matters, you will face criticism, rejection, and opposition. Guaranteed. The more visible you become, the more frequently it will come. The higher your standards, the more friction you'll encounter. The more authentically you show up, the more you become a target for those who have not yet learned to tolerate authenticity in others. The real question is not how do I eliminate these triggers? It's how do I rewire my response to them so they become fuel instead of friction? That rewiring is possible. It has been demonstrated in laboratory settings, in clinical practice, and in the lived experience of thousands of people who committed to exactly the process you're about to undertake. It starts with understanding what your reactivity is actually costing you, because until the cost is fully visible, the motivation to do the hard work of change is rarely sufficient. The invisible price tag. What reactivity actually costs you? Most people think of emotional reactivity as a minor inconvenience, a bad moment, a flash of anger or hurt that passes quickly and leaves no real mark. They're wrong. Let's start with the brain itself. Every time your stress response fires, every surge of cortisol, every amygdala hijack, there is a measurable neurological cost. Chronic stress doesn't just make you feel bad. It physically reshapes your brain over time, shrinking the prefrontal cortex and enlarging the amygdala. In practical terms, this means the more frequently you get triggered, the less capable you become of regulating your emotions, and the more easily you get triggered in the future. It's a self-reinforcing loop that compounds silently over years, and most people never recognize it's happening until the damage is already significant. The research on chronic stress and physical health is equally sobering. Sustained elevation of cortisol is associated with increased rates of cardiovascular disease, impaired immune function, disrupted sleep architecture, accelerated cellular aging, and higher incidence of anxiety and depression disorders when you allow yourself to be chronically triggered. When other people's behavior consistently governs your physiological state, you are not just giving them power over your emotions. You are quite literally giving them influence over your health and longevity. Think about what emotional reactivity does to a career. The professional world rewards calm under pressure above almost every other quality. The person who can think clearly in a difficult meeting, respond thoughtfully to a hostile client, or navigate a tense negotiation without losing their composure doesn't just perform better in the moment. They are perceived as more competent, more trustworthy, and more promotable, independent of their technical skill level. Study after study in organizational psychology confirms it. Emotional regulation is one of the strongest predictors of career advancement. Meanwhile, emotionally reactive people, regardless of how talented they are, develop reputations that follow them. They're the ones who can't take feedback, who make meetings uncomfortable, who need to be handled carefully. These labels, once attached, are extraordinarily difficult to remove. They get passed between managers in conversations you'll never be invited to. They show up in performance reviews written between the lines. They cost promotions, partnerships, and opportunities that never visibly disappear. They just quietly never arrive. In relationships, the damage is even more personal. When you're chronically reactive, you create an atmosphere of unpredictability around yourself. The people who love you start pre-processing their words before they speak. They calculate what they can and can't say. They begin managing you instead of connecting with you. Over time, this erodes the quality of intimacy that only genuine honesty can create. And both people end up lonely inside the relationship, even as the relationship technically continues. Your children, if you have them, are watching everything. They're not learning about emotions from the conversations you have with them about feelings. They're learning from your model, from what you actually do when you feel threatened, dismissed, or criticized. The patterns you embody are the patterns they absorb, usually so completely that they'll spend years in adulthood thinking those patterns are simply their personality, rather than an inheritance they can choose to return. Perhaps the deepest cost is the theft of authentic power. When you're reactive, you are, by definition, controlled. Someone else's behavior determines your internal state. You become entirely predictable, and predictability is exploitable. People who understand the dynamics of social interaction, consciously or not, learn exactly which triggers produce which reactions from you. Whether they use this knowledge deliberately or instinctively, the effect is the same. You are being steered by someone else. True power, the kind that generates real influence, real respect, and real freedom, comes from the opposite condition. It comes from being unsteerable, from being the person in the room whose response cannot be reliably predicted by provocation alone, from being genuinely sovereign over your own interior, not performing calm, not suppressing reaction, but actually living from a place where other people's behavior simply does not have the authority to determine your state. Here's the part that most personal development books skip over, and that may be the most important insight in this entire chapter. The triggers that cost you the most are almost always pointing towards something specific and addressable. They're revealing, with uncomfortable precision, the exact locations where your psychological architecture needs reinforcement. The criticism that stings most deeply is touching a belief about your own adequacy that you haven't fully resolved. The dismissal that makes you want to disappear is activating an old wound about belonging or worth that was probably written long before the current person had any idea you existed. The colleague whose success triggers disproportionate discomfort is illuminating an insecurity you've been trying to outrun, one that has been costing you energy every single day, whether you're conscious of it or not. These are not weaknesses to be ashamed of. They are coordinates, specific locations on the map of your inner world where growth is most available and most needed. The people who master their emotional triggers don't do it by developing thicker skin or becoming indifferent to outcome. They do it by developing deeper self-awareness, understanding what each trigger is actually pointing to, doing the work to address the underlying belief or wound, and building something in its place that cannot be as easily destabilized. The chapters ahead will show you exactly how to do this. But first, you need the foundational mindset, the interior architecture that makes everything else possible. The fortress mindset, sovereign over your own interior. Imagine you are the governor of a territory. Your territory has borders. It has laws. It has a culture, values, and standards that define how things are done inside its boundaries. You have jurisdiction over everything that happens within those borders, and nothing outside those borders has authority over what happens within them unless you choose to grant it. Now imagine that every person you interact with has the power to simply walk in, rearrange the furniture, set fires wherever they feel like it, and leave you to deal with the wreckage. No borders, no security, no sovereignty at all. You spend your days managing the aftermath of other people's incursions into your emotional territory. That's the life of someone who hasn't developed what I call the fortress mindset. The fortress mindset isn't a wall. It's not emotional armor designed to keep people out or sensations at bay. Those structures, the ones built from pain, from the determination that you'll never be hurt again, are rigid and brittle, and they have a tendency to collapse catastrophically when the right lever is found. The fortress mindset is something far more powerful. A deep, unshakable clarity about who you are, what you value, and what you will and will not allow to define your internal state. It's built not from avoidance, but from self-knowledge. And self-knowledge, unlike armor, only gets stronger under pressure. The foundational principle of this mindset is one of the most liberating truths in all of psychology, and also one of the most actively resisted. Other people's behavior is about them, not about you. Read that again, because the ego will do everything it can to argue with it. When your supervisor snaps at you in a meeting, that behavior is a direct readout of their current internal state. Their anxiety about a deadline, their unresolved insecurity about their own competence, their habitual communication pattern that developed long before you were part of the picture. It is a transmission from their interior, not an accurate assessment of your worth. When a friend cancels plans at the last minute without a real explanation, that is information about their emotional availability, their priorities, or what they're going through privately, not a verdict on how much you matter. When a stranger online tears apart something you created, that is a broadcast of their standards, frustrations, and relationship with criticism, not a factual report on the quality of your work. The ego hates this truth. The ego is addicted to personalization because personalization feels important. If everything is about us, we matter. We're central to the story. The problem is that this same mechanism that makes us feel central is the exact mechanism that makes us vulnerable to every careless word, every perceived slight, every dismissal, every judgment passed by someone who doesn't know us well enough to have authority over our self-concept. The fortress mindset requires a fundamental shift in orientation. From "why are they doing this?" to "me," to what is happening inside them that's producing this behavior. This is not a passive shift. It's an active, practiced reorientation that you will need to apply deliberately, hundreds of times, in hundreds of situations, before it begins to happen automatically. When you can hold that posture, when you can genuinely see a difficult person as a case study in human psychology rather than a threat to your emotional well-being, something remarkable happens. The emotional charge of the interaction drops significantly. You stop fighting to defend territory that was never actually under attack. You gain access to a quality of perception that's simply unavailable from inside the defensive crouch. Detachment, real detachment, not the cold, dismissive kind, is actually the condition of deepest engagement. Paradoxically, when you stop needing people to behave a certain way, you become far more capable of responding to how they actually are. You stop wasting energy on the gap between your expectations and reality, and start working effectively with reality itself. A crucial component of the fortress mindset is distinguishing between influence and control. You can absolutely influence how people treat you through your communication, your boundaries, your behavior, and the standards you consistently model. But you cannot control their choices, their reactions, their interpretations, or the internal processes that drive their behavior from moment to moment. The moment you accept this distinction completely, not intellectually, but in the visceral lived way that actually changes your physiology, you stop fighting a war that was never winnable. You redirect all that energy toward the territory that is genuinely yours. Your response. Your response is always yours. No one can take it. No one can mandate it. No matter what someone says or does, the gap between their behavior and your reaction is a space that belongs entirely to you. That space is the fortress. And the rest of this book is about how to build it, fortify it, and live inside it permanently, rewiring from the inside. The neuroscience of staying unshakable. Your brain processes incoming information through two parallel systems, and they don't operate at the same speed. The amygdala receives sensory information and produces an emotional response in approximately 12 milliseconds. The prefrontal cortex receives the same information and produces a considered response in approximately 24 milliseconds. Your emotional brain is twice as fast as your rational brain. By the time you're consciously aware of a situation, your emotional reaction has already been activated. The stress hormones are already moving through your bloodstream. The physical sensations of threat are already beginning to accumulate in your body. This is why traditional advice like just stay calm or think before you react so consistently fails. By the time you remember to stay calm, the physiological cascade is already underway. You're fighting upstream against your own biology, and biology almost always wins in the short term. But here's what the neuroscience also confirms. This is not a fixed disadvantage. The gap between stimulus and response can be trained. Not by slowing down the emotional response, that's fighting the system, but by building what researchers call response flexibility, a practiced buffer between what happens and what you do about it. That buffer is where your freedom lives, and developing it is the entire enterprise of emotional mastery. The first tool for building that buffer is physiological regulation. Your emotional state is intimately and bidirectionally linked to your physical state, particularly your breathing, your heart rate, and the tension patterns in your musculature. When your stress response fires, breathing becomes shallow and rapid, your heart rate climbs, and specific muscle groups contract, particularly in the jaw, shoulders, and abdomen. You can reverse engineer calm by deliberately changing your physiology because the brain-body system communicates in both directions. The most reliable technique is box breathing. Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold empty for 4. Repeat 3 cycles. This pattern activates your parasympathetic nervous system, the body's rest and restore circuitry, and physiologically counteracts the acute stress response within 60 to 90 seconds. This isn't metaphorical or motivational. It's biochemistry. The technique is used by Navy SEALs, emergency room physicians, and professional athletes before high-pressure moments precisely because it produces reliable, measurable results on demand. The second tool is cognitive reframing. Your nervous system doesn't respond to events. It responds to the interpretation of events. 2 people can receive identical criticism and have completely different emotional responses based entirely on the story they tell themselves about what it means. One person hears, "Your presentation needs work," as evidence of incompetence and feels shame. Another hears the same words as useful directional feedback and feels motivated. Same stimulus, entirely different internal experience. The difference is in the interpretation. The key to making reframing work under pressure is developing what cognitive behavioral therapists call pre-frames. Alternative interpretations you have ready before you need them, so they're accessible even when your rational brain is partially offline. When someone is rude to you, your available pre-frames might include, "They're dealing with something I know nothing about." This is their emotional state expressing itself, not a statement about my worth. This is an opportunity to practice staying steady under pressure. Their behavior tells me something about them, not about me. With enough repetition, these alternative frames begin to fire automatically. The brain, always optimizing for efficiency, will default to whatever interpretation pattern you've practiced most. The third tool is emotion labeling, backed by some of the most compelling neuroscience of the last 2 decades. Research from UCLA's Lieberman lab and replicated in multiple subsequent studies shows that when you name an emotion explicitly, I notice I'm feeling defensive right now. This is frustration arising. I recognize this as hurt. Activity in the amygdala measurably decreases, while activity in the prefrontal cortex increases. Naming an emotion literally gives you back access to your rational brain. The act of finding language. For an internal state requires prefrontal activation, and that activation counterbalances the amygdala's alarm signal. You can't completely stop the initial emotional response, but you can dramatically reduce how long it dominates your processing. Mindfulness meditation is the long-form version of this same capacity. When you meditate regularly, even just 10 to 15 minutes a day, you're training a specific cognitive skill called meta-awareness, the ability to observe your thoughts and emotions as events happening in your mind rather than being completely identified with them. A thought about being criticized is not the same as being criticized. A feeling of anger is not the same as being an angry person. This distinction, which sounds obvious in the abstract, is remarkably easy to lose in the heat of a trigger. Temporal distancing is another powerful technique. In the moment of a trigger, ask yourself how this will feel in a week, in a month, in a year. This question activates the prefrontal cortex's capacity for perspective and dramatically reduces the perceived magnitude of the threat. Most situations that feel enormous in the moment, the cutting comment, the public dismissal, the failed pitch, become genuinely minor with even 24 hours of distance. Knowing this in the moment doesn't eliminate the feeling, but it can significantly reduce how much authority you give it. The common thread across all these techniques is the creation of space. Space between stimulus and response. Space between emotion and action. Space between what happens to you and what you do with it. That space, cultivated deliberately over time, is where genuine freedom lives. It's where the person you're becoming makes their choices, rather than the person you used to be making them automatically. Flipping the script, how difficult people become your greatest teachers. Here is the reframe that changes everything, and that most people initially resist because it feels counterintuitive, almost to the point of absurdity. The people who trigger you the most are providing you with the most valuable growth training available, not metaphorically, literally. Consider how physical strength actually develops. When you lift a weight that challenges your muscles, you create micro tears in the muscle fiber. The soreness you feel in the day following intense exercise is the inflammation of that damage. What happens next, the healing, the rebuilding, the cellular reinforcement, is what creates strength. Growth is not comfort recovering from damage. Growth is the adaptation that happens in response to stress. Without the stress, the muscle doesn't develop. The comfort that most people seek is, in a very real biological sense, the enemy of strength. Psychological resilience develops by the exact same mechanism. Every time you encounter a situation that activates your defensive patterns, the criticism that makes your chest tighten, the dismissal that makes you want to prove yourself, the conflict that makes you want to either fight or disappear, your emotional system is being stressed. How you respond to that stress determines whether it weakens you or strengthens you. If you react from habit, snapping back, shutting down, ruminating for hours, seeking validation from others to soothe the wound, you reinforce existing patterns and emerge no stronger than you entered. If you use the trigger as training, pausing, applying a regulation technique, choosing a response that reflects your values rather than your wounds, you build new neural pathways and emerge genuinely more resilient. The difference between these two paths is not talent or willpower. It's awareness and deliberate practice. The people who deliver the triggers are, functionally, your personal trainers for psychological fitness. They're pushing the weights you need to be pushed with. Whether they intend to help you grow is entirely irrelevant. What matters is whether you use the opportunity. A personal trainer who pushes you hard because they genuinely want you to succeed, and a trainer who pushes you hard because they enjoy watching you struggle, produce the same physiological adaptation. The muscle doesn't know the difference. This reframe also transforms how you show up in difficult interactions. When you stop experiencing a challenging person as a threat and start experiencing them as a training scenario, the entire dynamic shifts. Your body relaxes. Your thinking clears. You have access to more creative, more nuanced responses because you're no longer operating from the survival state that narrows cognition. You can actually see the person in front of you, rather than just the threat they represent. There's a powerful question to carry with you into every difficult interaction. What would someone who has already mastered this challenge do right now? This question doesn't require you to have already mastered it. It simply asks you to temporarily embody the version of yourself you're moving toward. To act from that place, rather than from where you currently are. Done consistently, this practice accelerates development dramatically. You begin to close the gap between who you are and who you're becoming by behaving as though the gap has already closed. Every trigger is also a diagnostic of rare precision. When a specific type of criticism lands especially hard, it's pointing at a belief about your adequacy that still needs work. When a particular person's success triggers disproportionate discomfort, it's revealing an insecurity that's costing you energy you could be directing elsewhere. When rejection feels personally catastrophic rather than just disappointing, it's indicating that your sense of self-worth is still too heavily tied to external validation. These diagnostics are more accurate than most forms of therapy, precisely because they bypass the cognitive defenses that protect the ego from self-knowledge. Paradoxically, and this is one of the most consistent patterns observed by coaches and therapists who work in this space, when you stop being reactive to a difficult person, their behavior toward you often changes. Manipulative and provocative behavior is almost always seeking a specific response. It's designed, consciously or not, to produce a particular emotional reaction. When that reaction stops coming reliably, the behavior frequently escalates briefly, because the pattern that used to work is being tested for breakdown, and then diminishes. You become, in the most functional sense, uninteresting to their provocative impulses. The game requires a willing player on both sides. The deepest transformation this reframe makes possible is this. Instead of dreading encounters with the people who challenge you most, you begin to approach them with something approaching genuine curiosity, not performed equanimity, not gritted teeth tolerance, but real interest in what this particular training scenario is going to develop in you. That shift, from dreading the difficult to welcoming it as essential to the process, is the mark of genuine psychological maturity, and it's fully available to you starting now. Advanced tactics for high pressure situations, basic emotional regulation techniques work reliably in everyday friction. The minor slights, the routine criticism, the low-stakes disagreements that populate ordinary days. But what about the situations that go beyond every day? The sustained pressure of a hostile work environment where the difficulty is structural rather than occasional. The skilled manipulator who has studied your vulnerabilities with patience and precision. The high-stakes confrontation where the cost of losing your composure is professionally significant or personally devastating. For those situations, you need an advanced toolkit. The techniques in this chapter are drawn from the practices of professional negotiators, crisis responders, elite military personnel, and clinical psychologists working with high-conflict individuals. They work not because they suppress emotional response, but because they give you something to do with it that's more intelligent than simply reacting. The first advanced technique is emotional Aikido. In traditional Aikido, the practitioner doesn't oppose an attacker's force. They redirect it. The attacker's own momentum becomes the mechanism of their neutralization. Applied to emotional dynamics, the principle is, when someone comes at you with negative energy, don't meet force with force, and don't absorb it either. Redirect it. When someone attacks your competence, the rigid response is to defend or counterattack, both of which feed the conflict and confirm that the attack found its mark. The fluid response is to get genuinely curious. It sounds like you have specific concerns about how this is being handled. Help me understand what outcome you're actually looking for. This move redirects their attack energy into a collaborative problem-solving frame. They brought aggression. You responded with inquiry. The momentum they built for a fight has nowhere to go. The key to emotional Aikido is remaining fluid, rather than rigid, adapting to what's actually in front of you, rather than executing a defensive maneuver you planned in advance. The second technique is perspective stacking, rapidly cycling through multiple interpretations of the same triggering situation to prevent any single interpretation from achieving full emotional dominance. When someone treats you dismissively, you might move through these frames in rapid succession. They're overwhelmed and reverting to autopilot. This is a pattern they use with everyone, not just with me. This is teaching me patience under frustration. Their behavior says nothing about my value. This is useful information about their character and how to work with them effectively. No single frame may completely eliminate the emotional sting, but collectively, they prevent your brain from fixating on the most catastrophic interpretation. And it's that fixation that turns a difficult moment into a multi-hour spiral of rumination. The goal isn't to find the perfectly correct perspective. The goal is to maintain cognitive flexibility, which is itself the antidote to the tunnel vision that emotional hijacking creates. The third technique is strategic vulnerability. Most people assume that vulnerability is exposure, showing weakness that can be exploited by those who are already hostile. In reality, strategic vulnerability is one of the most disarming and powerful communication moves available in high-conflict situations. When someone tries to destabilize you by pointing out a flaw, the counterintuitive response is to agree, "You're right, that's an area I'm actively working on improving." The anticipated response was defensiveness or collapse. What you offered was calm self-awareness. That move lands with tremendous weight because it signals a level of psychological security that's hard to rattle, and it removes the specific leverage they were trying to apply. Temporal anchoring is the fourth technique. In the heat of a difficult moment, deliberately connecting yourself to the larger arc of your life, your long-term goals, your developing identity, your deepest values. Ask how this moment fits into the story of who you're becoming. Ask whether this interaction, viewed from 5 years forward, will appear as a defining crisis or as one of hundreds of forgettable friction points that you navigated cleanly. This question doesn't minimize the present difficulty. It contextualizes it. And context in high-pressure moments is what the stress response most aggressively strips away. Energy transmutation is the fifth technique. Rather than trying to suppress or escape difficult emotions when they arise, you learn to convert their raw energy into useful forward motion. Anger, properly channeled and given direction, becomes the fuel for determination and sustained effort. Frustration, reoriented toward problem solving, becomes focused analytical energy. Hurt, transformed by understanding its source, often becomes the motivation to build stronger boundaries and clearer communication. Anxiety, redirected toward preparation, becomes the heightened alertness of thorough readiness. Strategic disengagement is the sixth technique. Knowing when tactical withdrawal is more intelligent than continued engagement. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step back before you say or do something that costs you more than the original provocation was worth. I want to give this conversation the quality of attention it deserves. Let me take some time to think. And we can continue this when I'm better prepared. This move preserves your composure, models emotional maturity, and buys you the time to respond from wisdom rather than reaction. It is not retreat. It's choosing the ground on which you want to engage. Real-time cognitive reappraisal is the seventh technique. Training yourself to ask empowering questions the instant a trigger fires, without waiting for your emotions to settle first. How can I use this? What can I learn here? How is this making me stronger? What would the most capable version of me do right now? These questions redirect your brain from threat response mode to resource mode in real time. With consistent practice, the shift becomes faster and more automatic until eventually it happens without conscious effort. The way any complex skill eventually becomes second nature through sufficient repetition. The 4 personalities that will test you, and how to handle each. Not all difficult people operate from the same psychology, and one-size-fits-all responses consistently backfire. What works beautifully with one type of challenging personality can make things dramatically worse with another. Understanding the underlying driver of different kinds of difficult behavior allows you to tailor your response for genuine effectiveness rather than just emotional venting. The first type is the controller. Controllers have a compulsive need to manage outcomes, people, and processes. They micromanage, offer unsolicited direction, double-check your work, and become visibly anxious when things aren't proceeding according to their specifications. They often appear confident or even domineering on the surface, but the engine running underneath their controlling behavior is almost always fear. Specifically, the fear that without their active management of every detail, something catastrophic will happen. Controllers typically grew up in environments where unpredictability was dangerous, or where they experienced early loss of control in formative ways, and control became their primary coping mechanism for managing anxiety. The effective approach with controllers is to give them the experience of control without surrendering your autonomy. Offer structured choices within a framework you've already shaped. I see 2 solid ways we could approach this. Which direction makes more sense to you? This satisfies their need for agency in the decision while keeping the options within a range you've already evaluated. Acknowledge their expertise where it's genuine. They respond well to having their knowledge recognized, and this recognition often softens their need to dominate the process. The goal isn't to enable their controlling behavior indefinitely, but to channel it productively while maintaining the strategic direction you need. The second type is the attention seeker. These individuals have a seemingly insatiable need for attention, validation, and to be seen as significant. They interrupt conversations to redirect them toward themselves, create crises that position them as the center of concern, tell stories that consistently cast them as the most interesting person in the room, and become genuinely distressed when they're not receiving the level of engagement they feel they need. The fuel for this behavior is deep insecurity, a fear of being invisible, forgotten, or irrelevant. They learned early, often in childhood, that dramatic behavior reliably generates attention even when ordinary behavior doesn't. The strategy with attention seekers is counterintuitive but reliably effective. provide genuine positive attention for appropriate behavior before the drama starts. Ask for their input in low-stakes situations. Show real interest in their perspective during calm moments. This reduces the accumulated need that eventually expresses itself as escalation. During dramatic episodes, respond briefly and calmly. Acknowledge briefly, "That sounds stressful," and redirect your attention elsewhere. Demonstrating clearly, without hostility, that drama is not a reliable path to meaningful engagement gradually shifts the dynamic. The third type is the critic. Critics maintain a relentless focus on flaws, errors, and deficiencies. They rarely acknowledge what works. They seem to find fault in almost everything, often in ways that feel disproportionate to the actual situation. This pattern typically stems from some combination of perfectionism, terror of failure, low self-esteem temporarily relieved by identifying inadequacy in others, and a very high internal bar that they apply to themselves as harshly as they apply it to everyone around them. The key insight: critics tend to be harshest about the areas where they feel most insecure about themselves. With critics, resist every impulse to defend yourself or criticize them back. Both responses feed the adversarial dynamic and confirm that their approach is landing. Instead, thank them and go deeper. That's a useful point. What specifically would a stronger version of this look like? This move disarms the criticism by treating it as helpful input, forces them to be constructive rather than merely destructive, and demonstrates a level of psychological security that tends to earn, over time, a qualitatively different kind of engagement. The agree and redirect technique also works reliably. Find the legitimate kernel in their criticism, agree with it explicitly, and redirect towards solutions. The fourth type is the victim. Victims interpret their life primarily as something that happens to them, rather than something they're actively shaping. They collect grievances, resist solutions, and seem to derive a secondary benefit from remaining stuck: the attention, sympathy, and exemption from accountability that the victim role reliably provides. Their helplessness is often learned rather than inherent, and challenging it directly almost always produces resistance and a doubling down on the narrative. With victims, the key is to refuse to enable their helplessness while honoring their experience. That sounds genuinely difficult. What do you think your options are? Notice the precision of this question. It acknowledges their reality without taking on their problem, and it gently redirects toward their own agency. Avoid giving unsolicited advice because victims will almost invariably reject it and explain why it won't work. This is not deliberate manipulation, but a deeply ingrained pattern for maintaining the secondary benefits of the victim role. Set time boundaries on these conversations and redirect consistently toward questions about their own power and options. The overarching principle: understanding why someone behaves the way they do doesn't mean accepting mistreatment. It means responding skillfully rather than reactively. Compassion and boundaries are not opposites. They are most powerful when deployed together, with clarity and consistency. The art of the non-reactive response, disarming any attack. When someone comes at you, verbally, critically, with manipulation or hostility, your response in the next 3 to 5 seconds determines whether the situation escalates, stalemates, or transforms entirely. Most people default to one of two options: fight back or shut down. Neither achieves what you actually want, and both tend to compound the damage. There is a third option that few people discover, and that changes everything when they do: the non-reactive response. Not a passive response, not an avoidant response. An active, deliberate response that breaks the script the other person is unconsciously running. And in breaking it, changes the entire dynamic. Non-reactive responses work because they refuse to play the implicit game embedded in an attack. When someone comes at you with hostility, criticism, or manipulation, they're expecting one of a small set of reactions: defense, counterattack, or collapse. These are the responses they know how to handle. They have scripts prepared for each. When you respond instead with calm curiosity, genuine concern, or composed self-disclosure, you break the pattern they've set up. They have to shift modes entirely, and that shift is where the dynamic has the possibility of genuinely changing. Curious inquiry is the first and most reliably effective type of non-reactive response. When someone makes a hostile or critical comment, instead of defending or retaliating, you respond with genuine curiosity about their perspective. "That's interesting. Help me understand what you mean by that." Or, "It sounds like you feel strongly about this. Can you tell me more about where that's coming from?" The word to notice here is genuine. This must not be performed curiosity or sarcastic detachment. It must come from a real desire to understand, even if you disagree, even if what they've said was unfair. This response is powerful for a specific reason. Most people are rarely truly listened to. When you respond to an attack with genuine curiosity, rather than defensiveness or counterattack, you do something so unexpected that it often changes the nature of the interaction in real time. The hostility has nowhere to land. The person is suddenly being treated as someone worth understanding rather than someone to defeat. That experience is disarming in the most literal sense. Emotional validation is the second type. You acknowledge the emotions behind someone's words without agreeing with their content or endorsing their behavior. "I can hear that you're genuinely frustrated about this." Or, "It sounds like this has been building for a while." That makes sense. Validation meets the underlying need that was driving the attack in the first place. To feel seen. To feel that their experience is real and recognized. Most attacks are, at their core, escalated bids for acknowledgement. Strategic agreement involves finding the legitimate kernel in a criticism and building from there. "You're right that I could have communicated that more clearly. Let me try again. What specifically felt unclear to you?" This removes the adversarial frame entirely and transforms the interaction from a battle about who's right into a collaborative attempt to solve an actual problem. It also models the kind of psychological security that tends to invite better behavior in return. Concern redirection addresses the emotional subtext rather than the surface content. "You seem like something more than this specific issue is weighing on you today. Is everything okay?" Most attacks are not really about the stated subject. They're emotional overflow from somewhere else. When you address what's actually happening rather than the presenting complaint, you often reach something real and shift the conversation into territory where genuine resolution is possible. Transparent vulnerability, the most powerful and most courageous of the non-reactive options, is to honestly name your own experience. "I want to be honest. That landed harder than I expected. I'm working on that, and I genuinely appreciate understanding how I can improve." This requires real security, not performance. It cannot be faked convincingly. When it's authentic, it is almost impossible to maintain an attacking posture in response. It transforms the dynamic from conflict to collaboration, sometimes instantaneously. The prerequisite for all of these is authenticity. The moment any of these techniques becomes a manipulation, a calculated move to win rather than a genuine attempt to connect and understand, it fails. And it fails loudly. They work because they come from a real orientation. You actually want to understand. You actually care about the outcome. You actually have enough self-security to engage without becoming defensive. That's not a technique you can perform. It's a quality you develop through exactly the practices this book describes. The ripple effect, how emotional mastery builds your circle of influence. Something shifts in your social environment when you stop being reactive. It happens gradually at first, then with increasing velocity. The people around you begin to reorganize in relation to the new dynamic you're creating. And what emerges over time is a social environment that looks fundamentally different from the one you inhabited when reactivity was running the show. The people who thrive on volatility, who use emotional provocation as a form of connection, control, or entertainment, begin to drift. Not because you reject them, but because you stop providing the reactive engagement that made the dynamic work for them. When you don't flinch, don't snap back, don't take the bait, don't give them the emotional feedback they were seeking, you become uninteresting to their provocative patterns. And without friction to sustain the cycle simply ends. Meanwhile, something new begins to fill the space. People who operate from greater emotional maturity are naturally drawn to those who demonstrate it. Calm under pressure is one of the rarest and most magnetic qualities a person can embody. Leadership, trustworthiness, the ability to navigate complexity without becoming part of the complexity. These are qualities that are not merely respected. They are sought out in both personal and professional contexts with urgency by people who have learned how rare they are. In professional settings, emotional mastery makes you the person others orient toward during uncertainty. When tensions rise in a meeting, you become the natural, stabilizing presence. When conflicts emerge on a team, you become the bridge, not because you're trying to manage the situation, but because you've earned the trust that comes from consistent, steady engagement over time. Your influence doesn't come from authority. It comes from reliability, from people knowing, based on accumulated evidence, that your response will be thoughtful rather than reactive regardless of the pressure. In personal relationships, the transformation is equally profound and perhaps even more personally meaningful. When you stop being triggered by a partner's moods or behaviors, their emotional state loses the power to set the emotional weather of your home. When you can receive your children's emotional outbursts with presence rather than escalation, you create an environment where emotions are treated as normal and manageable, rather than dangerous and overwhelming. When you stop taking your friends' limitations personally, your friendships become places of genuine safety, contexts where both people can be honest, because neither person will punish the other for having feelings. The modeling effect of emotional maturity is one of its most powerful and least discussed dimensions. People don't learn emotional regulation primarily from being told about it. They learn it by watching it modeled in real situations, under real pressure, by people they respect. When the people around you observe that it's possible to receive criticism without becoming defensive, to stay grounded during conflict, to transform a tense interaction through composed engagement, they internalize those possibilities for themselves. You become living proof that a different way of being is available. That proof, witnessed firsthand, is worth more than any book or seminar. Building influence through emotional mastery also requires speaking to people's higher nature rather than their lower impulses. The difference between inspiring people and manipulating them is this: manipulation appeals to fear, insecurity, or the desire to avoid pain. Inspiration connects people to their own values, their own aspirations, and their own developing sense of who they're capable of being. One produces temporary compliance under pressure. The other produces sustained commitment that doesn't require monitoring. Consistency is the foundation on which all of this rests. People extend trust incrementally, based on repeated experiences that confirm or disconfirm their predictions about you. If you are steady 90% of the time but erupt in the remaining 10, people will structure their interactions around the 10%. Because the 10% contains survival-relevant information that the 90% doesn't. Trust is built slowly and destroyed quickly. Genuine, sustained consistency is the only foundation on which lasting influence can be built. The ultimate goal is not to become influential for its own sake, but to create the kind of relational environment where everyone around you has more room to function at their best. When you use your emotional mastery to build others up rather than tear them down, to create safety rather than generate fear, to facilitate honest conversation rather than enforce cautious performance, you contribute something real to the collective quality of the relationships and communities you're part of. That contribution is the true measure of what this work makes possible. The daily architecture of an unshakable mind. Emotional resilience is not a state you achieve once and maintain by default. It's a practice, a set of daily deliberate actions that continuously rebuild the neural substrate of regulation and keep the pathways of reactivity from reasserting themselves through neglect. The most consistently regulated people you'll ever meet share one characteristic above almost all others. They protect their morning. The first 60 to 90 minutes of your day establish the neurological baseline from which you'll respond to everything that follows. The neurological systems involved in emotional regulation are most plastic, most susceptible to influence, in the transitional state between sleep and full wakefulness. Whatever you feed those systems first shapes the template for your entire day. Most Americans surrender those minutes immediately, reaching for the phone, flooding their prefrontal cortex with other people's emergencies, anxieties, opinions, and outrage before they've established any internal center of their own. The day begins reactive, and it tends to stay reactive. The alternative is radical in its simplicity. Spend the first minutes of your day deliberately establishing your own mental state before exposing it to the external world. 5 minutes of slow, controlled breathing activates your parasympathetic system and establishes a physiological baseline of calm. 10 to 15 minutes of visualization, specifically rehearsing difficult scenarios and seeing yourself navigate them with the composure you want to embody, programs your nervous system with a different default response. Mental rehearsal is not wishful thinking. It's one of the most empirically validated performance enhancement techniques available, used by elite athletes, surgeons, concert musicians, and military personnel for exactly this reason. Your nervous system genuinely cannot distinguish between a vividly imagined experience and a real one. At the level of neural firing, when you repeatedly imagine yourself staying grounded under pressure, receiving difficult feedback with openness, responding to provocation with composure, navigating conflict with strategic clarity, you are literally pre-installing that response in your nervous system. Strategic journaling is the second cornerstone. This is not journaling as emotional venting, though that serves its purpose. This is structured evening reflection with a specific analytical orientation. What triggered me today, and how did I respond? What would I do differently with the advantage of hindsight? What pattern do I notice across multiple recent triggers? What is this pattern pointing to about the work that's still available for me to do? Include in your journaling practice a section specifically oriented toward what difficult people and challenging situations contributed to your development, not as a spiritual exercise in forced gratitude, but as a neurological practice. Every time you consistently direct your attention toward the developmental content of difficulty, you strengthen the neural pathway that finds growth in challenge automatically. Over time, this changes your default response. The brain learns to scan for opportunity the same way it currently scans for threat. Progressive stress inoculation is the third essential practice. Deliberately seek out, in controlled doses, the situations that typically trigger you. Have the conversation you've been avoiding. Set the boundary with the person who makes you uncomfortable. Speak up in the meeting where you usually stay quiet. Start small enough that success is achievable, and increase the challenge incrementally as your capacity develops. Each successful navigation builds neurological evidence, stored at the body level, not just the cognitive level, that you can handle what you've been afraid of. Mindful trigger observation throughout the day means cultivating the habit of noticing, without immediately acting, the moment your emotional state shifts. Where does tension appear in your body when you're triggered? What is the first cognitive distortion that arises? How does your attention narrow? What happens to your breathing? This level of self-observation, practiced consistently, builds the metacognitive awareness that creates the buffer between trigger and response. Energy management treats your emotional resources the way elite performers treat their physical ones, as finite, requiring intentional restoration, and worthy of strategic protection. Learn your depletion signals, the irritability that appears when reserves are running low, the difficulty finding perspective that signals the tank is nearly empty, the increased susceptibility to provocation that comes with fatigue. Act on those signals before. They produce reactive behavior rather than after. The earlier you intervene, the less energy the intervention requires. Evening integration closes the day deliberately. Process what happened. Extract what it taught you. Set your intention for how you want to show up tomorrow. Then release it. This is not passive. It's an active practice of metabolizing the day's accumulated emotional residue so that it doesn't compound overnight and carry forward into tomorrow's interactions as unprocessed sensitivity. The architecture of these practices is not about discipline for its own sake. It's about building a life that makes emotional regulation the default, rather than a constant act of will. When regulation is structural rather than volitional, you stop spending energy on the fight to stay calm and start spending it on everything else that matters to you. Becoming. Bulletproof to criticism and rejection. Criticism and rejection may be the most universal and most disabling emotional triggers in human experience. The fear of being judged inadequate, dismissed as unworthy, or excluded from belonging drives an enormous proportion of the behaviors that keep people small, safe, and stuck. Understanding why they hit so hard is the beginning of defusing their power. Social rejection activates the same neural circuits as physical pain. This is not metaphorical. Neuroimaging studies have confirmed it with considerable precision. Your brain processes being excluded from a group, criticized by a respected person, or rejected romantically with many of the same pathways it uses to process a broken arm. Evolution wired it this way because, for most of human history, tribal membership was survival. Being cast out of the group was a death sentence, not a metaphorical death, but actual death through exposure, starvation, or predation. The brain developed an alarm system for social exclusion of equal intensity to its alarm for physical threat. Your brain doesn't know that the performance review your manager left on your work isn't the same as being expelled from the tribe. It responds with the same physiological urgency. Understanding this doesn't eliminate the response, but it removes the secondary shame, the why am I reacting so strongly to something so small, that compounds the original pain. You're reacting with ancient hardware to a modern situation. That's not weakness. That's a mismatch between your evolutionary inheritance and your current context. The first transformation is learning to separate feedback from delivery. Most people reject potentially valuable criticism because it's delivered badly, with an edge, with condescension, with more emotion than information. But the packaging of feedback has nothing to do with its content. A message wrapped in hostility can still contain something true and useful. Training yourself to mentally strip away the delivery and look at the raw content. What is this person actually pointing at? Regardless of how they're pointing, allows you to receive potentially growth-accelerating information that reactive people routinely discard. This requires a specific cognitive move. Translation. When someone says, "You never pay attention to details," you translate, "There are detail-oriented areas in my work where this person believes I could improve." When someone says, "Your presentation was boring," you translate, "This particular person prefers a different presentation style." When someone says, "You're too sensitive," you translate, "This person is uncomfortable with emotional expression and is asking me to adapt to their preference." Translation extracts the useful signal from the noisy delivery and lets you evaluate the signal on its own merits. The second transformation is developing genuine evaluation criteria for feedback. Not all criticism deserves equal weight, and emotional maturity includes the capacity to discriminate thoughtfully. The relevant questions. Does this person have relevant experience or expertise in what they're commenting on? Do they have access to the full situation? Or are they passing judgment from the outside? Do they have any genuine investment in my success? Or is this projection, competition, or their own unprocessed frustration expressing itself outward? Feedback from a mentor who has navigated the specific terrain you're on, who genuinely wants you to succeed, and who has observed your work directly over time, is qualitatively different from feedback from someone who is annoyed, insecure, or simply exercising the human tendency to have opinions. The third transformation treats rejection as data about fit and timing rather than as verdict about worth. A job application that doesn't proceed tells you that this organization, at this moment, chose a different candidate. It says nothing about whether you're capable of the role or whether you'll find the right position. A romantic rejection tells you that this specific person in this specific context isn't the right match. It says nothing about whether you're worth loving or whether love is available to you. A business proposal that doesn't land tells you about these particular decision makers with these particular priorities at this particular moment. It says nothing about the ultimate value of what you're building. Reframing rejection as information rather than judgment is not denial. It is accuracy. Rejection is literally data. It tells you something specific about fit, timing, or approach that you can use to make better decisions going forward. The only thing rejection categorically does not tell you is that you lack worth. Rejection resilience, the capacity to continue pursuing meaningful goals despite repeated rejection, is among the most practically important skills in this entire book. Every significant achievement involves sustained exposure to rejection. Successful entrepreneurs hear no from investors hundreds of times before the one yes that changes everything. Successful artists accumulate staggering levels of rejection before any recognition arrives. Successful athletes face defeat far more often than victory in the early stages of development. The ones who ultimately succeed are not the ones who avoided rejection. They're the ones who develop the emotional infrastructure to continue moving forward while carrying it. The foundation of that infrastructure is self-validation that isn't contingent on external response. When your sense of your own worth, effort, and direction is grounded in something you carry rather than something you receive from others. When you can evaluate your own growth, recognize your own progress, and maintain your own assessment of what you're building independent of whether anyone else currently agrees. Criticism and rejection become data points rather than defining verdicts. They still register. They're supposed to. But they register at a manageable volume, not at the full volume of existential threat. The mental models of the genuinely unshakable. Behind every consistently unshakable person is a set of operating assumptions about life, relationships, and difficulty that most people never consciously develop. These are the mental models, the internal maps of reality that determine not just how they respond to individual triggers, but how they relate to challenge and difficulty as a whole orientation. The first model understands life as a leveled game. Most people are playing the default level. Life happens to them. They react. They try to recover. They prepare for the next impact. At this level, other people's behavior has enormous power because their behavior determines the emotional weather of your life. You are a passenger in your own interior. At the intermediate level, you recognize that while you cannot control what happens, you can always choose your response. The locus of attention shifts from the external event to the internal decision. This is where most personal development content lives, and it's genuinely valuable. But it's not the deepest level available. At the advanced level, you understand that difficult people and challenging situations are not obstacles to your development. They are your development. The harder the challenge, the greater the growth available within it. You stop tolerating difficulty and start actively welcoming it as the mechanism by which you become more capable. At the master level, you operate from a deep trust that every experience, without exception, is contributing to the person you are becoming. Difficulty is not the opposite of progress. It is the mechanism of it. This isn't a spiritual belief. It's an empirically observable fact about how human psychological capacity develops. The second model treats yourself as a scientist studying human behavior. You are not a participant in conflict. You are a researcher observing it with professional curiosity. Every difficult interaction is a data point. Every trigger is a finding. Every challenging person is a case study in the vast and fascinating territory of human psychology. This reframe creates immediate, profound distance from the emotional charge of triggering situations. You can't be devastated by the behavior of a research subject. You can be fascinated, curious, deeply interested. But devastation requires identification, and a scientist maintains appropriate analytical distance. The third model understands your emotional responses through the lens of economics. Every reaction has a cost and a return. Spending 2 hours in rumination after a difficult meeting has a cost. Clarity, productivity, your physical state, the quality of your other interactions, your sleep. What is the return on that investment? Sometimes the return is genuinely valuable. Processing is necessary, and emotions that aren't metabolized don't disappear. They compound. But often the return is negligible. 2 hours feeding a fire that produces no heat you can actually use. The economic lens asks whether this expenditure is producing value commensurate with its cost. The fourth model positions you as the author of your own story, rather than a character in other people's narratives. Most people live their lives reacting to the expectations, judgments, and stories of others, trying to meet the standards set by their family of origin, their culture, their social group, the critics in their life. In this model, you are not a character in anyone else's story. You are writing your own. Criticism is not a verdict on your story. It's a note in the margin from a reader who has their own preferences. You can consider it thoughtfully. You don't have to incorporate it. The fifth model frames emotional mastery as a martial art practiced daily. A martial artist doesn't expect to achieve skill without consistent training. They don't feel demoralized by difficulty during practice. Difficulty during practice is the point. Every sparring session, every challenging technique, every moment of being genuinely tested is making the skill more real, more integrated, more automatic, applied to your emotional life. Every trigger you face is a training scenario. Not every training scenario will go perfectly. Some you'll handle with skill. Some you'll fumble. What matters is showing up consistently, reviewing the performance honestly, and improving with each repetition. The sixth model understands that everyone is operating from the current limits of their capacity. The colleague who undermines you is doing so from their level of emotional maturity, which is to say, from the skills they have developed so far. The parent who criticized relentlessly was working from the emotional tools they had, which were often insufficient and often inherited from their own damaged history. The partner who is difficult to love is doing the best they can with what they have built to this point. This is not an excuse for harmful behavior, and it does not preclude setting boundaries with clarity and firmness. It is a reframe that generates automatic compassion. Not the perform kind, not the martyred kind, but the genuinely liberating kind that says, this behavior is coming from limitation, not from a verdict on my worth. I don't have to take it personally, because it isn't personal. It's their story being expressed, not mine being written. Building the systems that protect your peace. Automatically, the goal isn't to white-knuckle your way through every difficult interaction through sheer force of will. That approach is exhausting, unsustainable, and produces a kind of brittleness that eventually breaks under sufficient pressure. The goal is to build an environment, a social context, and a set of daily structures that make emotional regulation the path of least resistance, something that happens by design rather than by constant effort. Start with your physical environment. The spaces you inhabit have a documented and measurable effect on your stress baseline. Clutter creates background cognitive load that depletes the prefrontal resources needed for emotional regulation. Disorganized environments increase low-grade anxiety through the constant low-level awareness of unfinished business. Natural light, spatial order, and intentional design, even modest adjustments, lower the resting activation of your stress response and leave more regulatory capacity available for the moments that genuinely demand it. Your information environment deserves equal attention, and in the current media landscape, it may deserve more. The average American adult now consumes more than 7 hours of media per day across devices. The vast majority of this content, news, social media, algorithmically curated video, is selected and optimized not for your well-being or your growth, but for your engagement. And engagement in the digital media economy is most reliably produced by emotional arousal, outrage, fear, anxiety, tribal conflict, and the cognitive activation of perceived threat. This means that your default information diet is almost certainly engineered at the algorithmic level to keep your amygdala chronically activated. Every hour of unrestricted news and social media consumption is an hour of deliberate amygdala stimulation. Curating your information diet is not ignorance, avoidance, or irresponsibility. It is a practical act of neurological self-preservation that directly expands your capacity for regulated, thoughtful, effective response to the real challenges in your actual life. Your social environment is perhaps the most powerful environmental variable of all. The quality of emotional regulation in the people you spend the most time with shapes your baseline more than almost any other single factor. Emotional dysregulation is contagious. The neurological mechanism for this is called emotional contagion, mediated partly through mirror neuron systems, and sustained exposure to chronic reactivity in others gradually raises your own reactivity baseline, even if you're doing everything else right. This doesn't mean ruthlessly cutting people out of your life. It means being honest about which relationships consistently deplete your emotional reserves versus restore them, and being intentional about the balance. Invest deliberately in relationships where emotional maturity is modeled, where honest communication is genuinely safe, and where your growth is encouraged. rather than subtly undermined. Buffer zones between high-demand situations are among the most underutilized regulatory tools available. Instead of rushing from one difficult context directly into another, build transition time into your schedule. 15 minutes after a hard meeting to decompress before taking your next call. A brief walk before a difficult conversation to establish your physiological baseline. A short decompression ritual after high-stress periods to metabolize the accumulated residue before it spills into the next context. These transitions are not wasted time. They are the maintenance windows that keep the system running cleanly. Accountability structures accelerate development enormously and are frequently the difference between people who talk about emotional growth and people who actually achieve it. Find one other person who shares your commitment, a coach, a mentor, a close friend with similar orientation, and build in regular conversations where you examine your patterns honestly, celebrate genuine progress, and course-correct when old patterns reassert themselves. The insights available from someone who knows your specific triggers and tendencies, who can offer perspective when you're too close to see clearly, and who holds you accountable to the person you've said you want to become, are simply not available from solo reflection alone. Financial and practical autonomy deserves mention because it is rarely discussed in the context of emotional regulation, and yet it matters enormously to the structural conditions of your psychological freedom. When your material security is entirely dependent on someone who treats you poorly, your capacity to hold boundaries is compromised, regardless of your psychological sophistication. When you lack practical skills or economic reserves, you're more likely to tolerate mistreatment because you need the relationship to survive. Building financial resilience, developing diverse skills, and reducing structural dependencies that make you vulnerable to manipulation are practical acts of emotional self-care. The recovery rituals you establish after genuinely difficult interactions or challenging days are the final piece of this system. Instead of hoping you'll bounce back from stress naturally over time, have specific practices that actively restore your equilibrium. Physical movement that metabolizes stress hormones, time in natural environments that down-regulates the nervous system, creative activities that provide constructive engagement for the mind, connection with people who restore rather than deplete. These are not luxuries. They are the maintenance that keeps the instrument functioning at the level you need it to. Integration, becoming the most unshakable version of yourself. Everything in this book has been pointing toward a single destination, and it's time to name it with complete clarity. The goal is not to never feel anything. The goal is not to become the person who never gets triggered, never feels the sharpness of a criticism that lands, never experiences the sting of rejection or the heat of being genuinely unfairly treated. Those experiences are evidence of your humanity. They're evidence that you care, that you're invested, that you're in the game, rather than watching safely from a distance. Pursuing their absence is not growth. It's a more sophisticated form of the same avoidance that reactive people practice. The goal is to become the person for whom none of those experiences are final, for whom getting shaken is temporary rather than catastrophic, for whom the return to center is so practiced, so automatic, so deeply integrated into how you move through the world that the distance between disruption and restoration keeps shrinking with every cycle. Not because fewer things disturb you. You may find that more things move you, not fewer as you become more genuinely present, but because your capacity to metabolize disturbance and return to center has become reliable. That's what integration means. The skills you've been developing are no longer skills you consciously deploy. They're just you. The distinction between stimulus and response, the space you've been cultivating, has become your natural habitat. You live there. You make choices from there. Other people's behavior passes through there before it reaches your actions. And in that passage, you decide who you're going to be. In your career, the integrated version of you is the one who receives the hardest feedback with genuine curiosity rather than defensiveness, who stays strategic under the kind of pressure that derails most people, who makes better decisions in crisis specifically because they're not clouded by the same emotional activation that's clouding everyone else in the room, who develops a reputation, quiet, powerful, and difficult to manufacture, as someone whose composure can be counted on when it matters most. In your relationships, this version of you shows up fully present, not defended, not performing equanimity, but genuinely there. You can receive a partner's frustration without treating it as an attack on your adequacy. You can parent with consistency rather than reactivity, giving your children a model of emotional management that will influence their nervous systems for decades. You can maintain friendships through the inevitable friction of real closeness because you're not afraid of conflict and you don't require every interaction to feel comfortable. In your creative and professional output, emotional mastery removes the most significant brake on genuine contribution. The fear of criticism, the anticipation of rejection, the concern about judgment from people whose opinion you haven't consciously decided matters. These are the forces that cause most people to edit themselves before they even begin. When those forces lose their authority, what becomes possible is the unfiltered expression of your actual vision, your real perspective, your genuine voice. That's what the world actually needs from you. Not the managed version, the real one. In your own inner life, the integration produces something that may be the most valuable thing in this book, a fundamentally different relationship with your own imperfection. You can face your limitations without being overwhelmed by shame. You can acknowledge mistakes without it triggering a cascade of self-attack. You can see yourself clearly, the parts that work and the parts that still need work, without the defensive distortion that makes honest self-assessment so threatening to most people. This radical self-acceptance is paradoxically the foundation of authentic change. When you can see yourself clearly without defending against what you see, you can change what needs changing without the enormous energy tax of fighting the reality that something needs to change. Growth becomes lighter. Development becomes easier. Not because the work is less demanding, but because you're no longer simultaneously doing the work and arguing with the need to do it. The most important shift of all is this. The version of you that this work produces doesn't only benefit you, it ripples outward into every system you're part of. Every time you respond with composure in a situation that typically generates heat, you shift the dynamic for everyone in it. Every time you model curiosity instead of defensiveness, you demonstrate what's possible. Every time you stay calm during conflict, you create space for real dialogue and resolution rather than just mutual escalation. Your emotional mastery is not a private achievement. It is a contribution to the quality of your relationships, the effectiveness of your teams, the emotional safety of your family, and ultimately to the collective emotional intelligence of the communities you inhabit. One person with genuine stability has an outsized stabilizing effect on every system they're embedded in. That's not idealism. That's how social systems work. Begin where you are. Apply the first technique that resonated most in the next difficult moment you encounter, then the next. Build the practice one repetition at a time, the way all lasting things are built, not through dramatic transformation, but through the steady accumulation of better choices. You will get triggered again. You will have moments where the old patterns reassert themselves. That is not failure. That is training. What you're building isn't perfection. It's unshakability. And unshakability isn't the absence of storm. It's the certainty, earned through practice, reinforced through experience, grounded in genuine self-knowledge, that you have what it takes to meet any storm and find your way back to center. That certainty, once established, cannot be taken from you. That's the fortress. And now you know how to build it.